you want to stay on with us, please just hit continue. Okay, so we are here to talk about what the four of us are calling the Civil Reparations Project, and want to start out by saying, full reparations have to happen at the government level. So that is not something other than to continue to advocate the policy level for that, which we hope you all will do, and we'll be able to provide some resources for that in a follow-up email to this presentation. But what we're really talking about this afternoon is, in the spirit of reparations, what the white community can do now without waiting for that political will to bend. So this is really a kind of informal presentation that we hope will be the starting point of a discussion with you all. And we want to learn as much as we can from you and how you react to the information that we're sharing and how we've kind of set this presentation up. So again, please share freely in the chat, and we'll also be having the breakout sessions and a survey afterwards where we'll be hoping for all of your feedback. The four of us presenting tonight, myself, I'm Caitlin Lombardi. We also have Shannon Keith, Natalie Lawrence, and Elizabeth Rodland. Really, we are just four random white women who know that we can do better, who know that white community can do better, and that many in the white community want to do better, and we just need to start. So to begin, we definitely want to share that we're speaking to you all from land that was stolen from the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Coast Salish people. We're all from the Seattle area, which is an area that the Pacific Northwest belonged to 66 distinct tribes and was taken through violence and dishonesty. And particularly because we're talking about the redistribution of wealth in the form of property and land tonight, we first want to acknowledge that fact, how we came to inhabit this particular land, and the reality that the ownership of it was created by white people and used to destroy entire cultures. So we've shared the link to Real Rent Duwamish here, and encourage everyone in this geographic area to follow that link and find out how you can pay what they call rent to stay on this land. And if you know of other things like that, for those who are joining us from other areas, please drop those in the chat. We'd love to know about those initiatives. And of course, everything that we bring to this conversation, the four of us, we have learned from Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We are hoping to spark a new conversation in our community of how we can move white wealth without waiting for full government level reparations, but none of these ideas are new. Honestly, they've been asked for and requested for centuries, so we'll start there. We're going to have three asks for everyone today. Number one, to make a contribution to the Africatown Community Land Trust. We did not want to gather a bunch of white people who believe in the idea of reparations and not take action and make some kind of reparative investment in our community. So we're excited to tell you a little bit more about that initiative later in the presentation. Number two, we hope that you'll participate openly and honestly in this conversation about moving white wealth. We know that all of you are here because you want to do something to address racial inequality, and surely there are people here who have read more books on anti-racism and know more Black history than we do, who follow incredible thought leaders and donate their money and volunteer their time very intentionally and wisely. So we thank those of you coming from that position for joining us. And some of you might be joining us without having read any books or thought about this much and are just now, deciding that you've got to take some action. So thank you as well. We'll go over some historical facts and share some ideas that we've been having around making good on our promises. But we hope you really find it interesting and thought-provoking, and that we'll be able to learn from you about how this resonates or doesn't resonate. We know you're invested in doing better, and we want to know what's possible. Which leads to number three, which is we also hope that you will fill out the follow-up survey afterwards. It will be something you can do anonymously, and hope that you'll share your thoughts with us as we try to take this project further. So to begin the substantive portion of this conversation, we have kind of a we believe statement that brought the four of us together And that's the foundation of where we'd like this project to grow from, which is that we believe through whiteness, we have become untethered from our own humanity, disconnected from empathy, from history, and from place through centuries of justifying violence in the name of profit and property. Just sit with that for one moment. Feel free also to screenshot things if there are things that you want to think about later on. From there, we're here to do some things and want to kind of lay some groundwork of what we are here to do and what we're not here to do. First and foremost, we're here to take responsibility for that humanity and work towards getting it back. It is us who are not comfortable living in the world as it is right now and desire to change it. So any efforts to remedy that really cannot be considered charity, but is something that we're working on to all of our mutual benefit. And to lay some more groundwork, we're here to respond to repeated calls for action from the Black community and to take reparative action to address the damages of white supremacy. And some things we're not here to do. So if you feel these pop up for you, please give it a second thought. We're not here to question the experiences of Black people or to ponder nuances and exceptions to the starkly worse outcomes for Black people in the US in 2021, or to utilize the existence of other injustices to defer action on this. So it's been a year since the 9-minute recording of George Floyd's murder demanded white Americans look the ongoing brutality of racism directly in the face. And since then, we have done a few things. 30 states have enacted some type of policing reform legislation. We've read a lot of books. White people are reading a lot of books. We've put anti-racism books on the bestseller list. Books about race increased by up to 6,800% over the last year, which is pretty remarkable. The top 3 of those were White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo, and How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. It is interesting, I think, and important to note that the highest seller of those 3 was White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which is both the oldest of those titles and also written by a white woman, unlike the other 2. Just something to think about. And we've also recognized Juneteenth very recently as a federal holiday, and in general, many people, especially those outside of Texas and especially white people, learned about Juneteenth for the first time over the last 12 to 18 months, which we would actually love for you all to share in the chat when you learned about Juneteenth, if that was something that you knew about before June of 2020 or before the ongoing protests, if it was something you learned about in school, because when polled, 90% of educators in K through 12 say that it is not part of their curriculum. So it is not a surprise that many of us got to adulthood without, many of us white people got to adulthood without having encountered that before. So we've also done some other things since June 2020. Police continue to kill people at the same or slightly higher rate than in most previous recent years. Over 1,070 people have been killed by police the past year. 1 in 3 of them are Black, despite Black people being 1 in 10 of the population. 361 bills to restrict voting rights were introduced this year, which we know directly target Black people across the country. 21 states have introduced or passed legislation to ban the teaching of critical race theory, a very hot topic on Fox News right now, and all over, which, as we also know, is an incredibly misguided and strange attempt to create, an environment of fear around even simply addressing the truth of our history. And lastly, just 18% of Americans, and declining, expressed support for the movement to defund police, which was the loudest, most clear request that came from Black communities during the protests, just 18%. Next, and I want us all to sit again with this unfortunate graph, but this shows the change in support for Black Lives Matter by racial group over the past, well, since the beginning of 2020. And you'll see all of the lines peak in what was the summer of 2020. So right in June, when Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd were making headlines. It wasn't exactly when they were actually murdered, all of them, but when they were in the news, you saw support peak. And then you see almost all the lines dwindle down again over the next 12 months to around where they were or a little bit higher, except for that pinkish purple line, which shows white people overall have less support for Black Lives Matter now than they did at the beginning of 2020 or throughout, certainly throughout the summer of 2020. So when we, talk about the racial reckoning that was supposed to happen, this is pretty stark contrast to that. And honestly, most of us do not know Black people. We do not regularly have Black people in our lives. Despite our supposed desire and possibly our own perception of reality, we live incredibly segregated lives. Schools today are more segregated than they were in the late 1960s. And of course, predominantly white school districts receive billions more, 23 billion more actually in funding compared with predominantly Black, Indigenous, and people of color school districts. 75% of white Americans do not have a single non-white friend. This continues into our, our neighborhoods where we live, our schools, our leisure time, and our friendships. Here in Washington, the entire population is just 3.7% Black. And in Seattle, our largest city, fewer than 7% of residents are Black. I think this is really critical for this conversation, that even white people who would like to be allies likely do not interact with Black people in an authentic way on a regular basis. We cannot solve for the kind of injustices and inequities that we're talking about tonight by waiting in our work meetings to catch a microaggression and speak up for a Black colleague. We have to do that too, but it will not close the wealth gap, it will not empty our prisons, and it won't bring George Floyd back to life. It's very important to admit and acknowledge this fact so we can move past, or at least alongside, the belief that racism is something that we can solve by being better people or checking our own biases. Very important things on an individual level, but nowhere near enough to make systemic and structural change. So what are Black thought leaders and the Black community saying now? Frederick Joseph: there is no greater gaslighting than the people who invented race as a construct to oppress others within every single system that exists, telling those oppressed people that they're making everything about race. Around this time last year, we witnessed the pseudo-white awakening, but you didn't keep your promises, and we also knew you wouldn't. I must confess that I'm tired of watching white folks reflect on their white privilege. No one ever seems to move into radical action. Folks want to be comfortable, middle-class, armchair activists. That's not how this works. We didn't ask for a Juneteenth to be observed as a national holiday. We wanted an end to police violence. Of course, these are a tiny, tiny sampling of many statements just like them, all completely justified. And part of why we wanted to invite the white community and people who feel they've benefited from white privilege to this conversation, to get our people to move this forward without others needing to watch us reflect on our white privilege. So we believe we cannot go another day without taking action to repair the deadly anti-Blackness that defines the United States, past and present. And for the next portion, more why on that, I'm going to pass the reins to Elizabeth.
Hi all. So for this next portion of the presentation, I am going to be taking us through some parts of our history that are very deeply disturbing, as Caitlin mentioned in the beginning. So I just wanted to give everyone a heads up and also take a moment to thank you for being here again and being present and being willing to sit with this heavy and important information. So to broadly summarize, present conditions were created by white people through structural and systematic racial terror, beginning with the genocide of our Indigenous peoples and slavery. We're often taught about slavery as this terrible thing that happened to Black people, but slavery doesn't just happen. White people invented race to excuse and inspire horrific deeds in the name of profit, beginning with the slaughtering and scalping of Indigenous women, children, men, and Two-Spirit peoples, cutting off parts of their human flesh and wearing it in pride, to piling African people in slave ships, throwing babies into the waters that pregnant African women birthed at sea, to 250 years of torturing enslaved Black people, often beating them to death for show, using sexual violence as both a pastime and a tool of control, selling off children as young as 2, and starving newborn babies to death while forcing their mothers to breastfeed the infants of white enslavers. All these things are almost too hideous to even speak out loud, but it was completely regular, legal, protected behavior for white people in the United States for much, much too long. So I'm going to pause there just for a second and take a deep breath. And if my baby was awake, I would give her a hug. Okay, Caitlin. So there will never be an economic way to absolve the acts of slavery, yet the economic facts remain. So human lives and bodies were commodified and used to build wealth. I'm going to repeat a few statistics here in effort to not let them just slide by. So more than 12 million human beings were kidnapped, sold, bred, and enslaved in the Western Hemisphere. And as pictured in this slide, they could be inventoried and the dollar value of their lives written down on a piece of paper, some as young as 4 years old. Banks like JP Morgan and Chase and creditors accepted enslaved people as quote unquote collateral for loans and were authorized to repossess them if the loan defaulted. Insurance companies like Aetna and New York Life Insurance also profited from the policies sold to insure enslaved people as property. And unsurprisingly, these companies live on today, their profits still growing. Also, throughout 250 years of chattel slavery, white people stole what can only be estimated as quadrillions in labor. And in 1830, 1 million enslaved Black people generated half of the US global exports. That's half picking cotton. And what probably most of us are most familiar with is at the end of the Civil War, 4 million free Black people were each promised 40 acres and a mule. But Andrew Johnson went back on that promise, taking land that would have been worth 3.1 trillion. That's 3.1 trillion today. And by design, most of that was actually given to former enslavers as reparations for their lost property. So if we go to the next slide, you can see a quick timeline of just how little or like really none of the United States existence has occurred outside of slavery or very deliberate institutional oppression. While white people have been given repeated chances to just get through hardship, build wealth, or plan for their future, Black people have never been allowed to just simply be anywhere or have anything. For example, the GI Bill, which helped World War II veterans secure land and wealth, gave them a year of unemployment payments, education expenses, living stipends, guaranteed loans for houses and farms and land, and also was structured to prevent the 1.2 million Black veterans from those benefits. So like on the graph, you can see how long, like that red portion, that's how long white enslavers thrived compared to the US population alive today in that top right corner. Many who believe that there's no possible way impacts from slavery could remain. And we know that is different, and we know differently, which leads me into the next slide, which is the current economics of Blackness. And I'm going to throw some more information your way, but I appreciate you and stay with us. So in unemployment, Black Americans are twice as likely to be unemployed as white Americans. In income, Black Americans earn 59 cents for every dollar earned by white Americans, averaging 29,000 less per year. In home ownership, 42% of Black families own their home, while 73% of families, like my own their home. In maternal health, Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth or due to pregnancy-related causes. For incarceration, Black Americans are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated, prevented from accumulating wealth. For generational wealth, Black Americans are 16 times more likely to be in at least the 3rd generation of poverty, defined as having less than 48 grand a year for a family of 4 in today's money. And with that, I have another question for everyone here that you can throw in the chat. Do you intend to, or have you already inherited wealth from the generation above you? And the 4 of us presenters will be getting into that and explaining more in depth later in the presentation for ourselves. Next slide. Oh yeah, we're here. Okay, sorry. Overall, the racial wealth gap has not gotten better. In fact, it's gotten worse, as indicated in this graph depicting wealth in the thousands by the 2019 dollar standard. The median white family has 10 times more wealth than the median Black family. And this is why we're here. So I'd like to hand it now to Natalie, who will go over what hasn't been working.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for being here. So one of the things that is not working is capitalism. So this is by design. An economy that became the greatest in the world expressly because of the stolen labor of millions of African and Black people will never freely correct the key feature that made it so, a racial hierarchy that places Black people at the very bottom and erases Indigenous people entirely. So while we talk about land and wealth accumulation today, we feel it's really important we address the economic system that we all live in. As 2 of capitalism's most defining traits are wealth accumulation and private land ownership and the acknowledgement of private land ownership. So a lot of proponents of capitalism sometimes say that it puts people on an even playing field and that you get what you put in, and that if you work hard enough that that piece of the pie will soon be yours. But if private property and accumulated wealth can be passed down through families over generations and generations, white people have essentially been hoarding all of this pie and stuffed a bunch of extra pies in their freezer for a rainy day. So by upholding this economic system, we've perpetually barred people from actually getting some of that pie that we claim is so readily available to people who are willing to work hard enough. And 60% of that stolen land is privately owned in the United States, with 40% of that non-real estate land being owned by the richest 1% of America. And with capitalism, we will always be exploiting a working class, and the people who suffer most are workers of color. It will prioritize profit over everything else, including our environment and the health of our people. And I'd like to end my rant on capitalism with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. from 1967. And this is a quote I often see conveniently omitted from people's Facebook posts on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life must be changed. America is a hypocritical nation, and we must put our own house in order. Philanthropy has also not been working too well. So while we acknowledge that philanthropy has done, of course, there's good nonprofits, they are doing good work. Approximately only 1% of foundation funding is specifically for Black communities and our neighbors in the North. I'm from Canada, so I was particularly interested in this statistic. In Canada, Black-led organizations receive less than 0.1% of funds from Canadian foundations, and Black-led organizations have 76% less in general funding than white-led organizations. And white people hold 80% of the top positions in the nonprofit industry. 92% of the foundation presidents are white, meaning that we have a lot of white people controlling a lot of wealth. And so that is not actually getting into the right communities that know exactly what to do with that money. And on a survey, Bridgespan did a really great study, and they surveyed 25 different cities, and they found that community foundations in these cities cumulatively spent $78 per person overall, but only spent $6 per Black person. And these were in cities that had really high percentages of Black citizens. So we can move on to one more thing that hasn't been working, which is the government. So we have paid some woefully insufficient reparations before. So this idea is not new to the US government. We paid some Japanese people $1.6 billion after internment during World War II. We've paid $1.3 billion to Native Americans for some stolen land. And again, 60% of the US of that stolen land is now privately owned by individuals and corporations. But we have never paid Black people reparations. So progress is slow and halting. I'm sure a lot of us know about HR 40 and have been following that quite closely. It was a bill that would create a federal commission to study the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery, looking at various forms of economic, political, educational, and social discrimination, and to develop proposals for appropriate remedies, including potential reparations for Black Americans. This bill was first introduced in 1989, which is 32 years ago, and got only finally approved by the Judiciary Committee, and now awaits a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. So 32 years to almost get to the point of maybe studying the potential impacts of reparations. I think there's a lot of loaded words there that are obviously halting our progress, and it's just beyond too slow. There are some cities that have 11 mayors that have come together in a coalition to move similar measures in their more smaller populations. And these are mayors from Los Angeles to a small city in Oklahoma, and are hoping that they can kind of be a model for the federal government to work off of. So St. Louis, Missouri elected their first Black mayor, Tishwara Jones, and she said, Black Americans don't need another study that sits on a shelf. We need decisive action to address the racial wealth gap holding communities back across our country. And with that, I will pass it back over to Caitlin.
Thank you. All right, so given all of these numbers that we're talking about, both historically and the economics of Blackness that Elizabeth shared earlier, resources must move. In the system that we've built, where you need money to buy health, to buy safety, to buy autonomy, to buy your own future in the form of retirement or savings, we won't solve for any of the inequities we've discussed until and unless we move massive amounts of unrestricted money into Black bank accounts. If we are at a loss for stopping police killings, this is a critical aspect of that fight. Thinking back to the first slide that we shared when you joined, stating the safest communities are not the ones with the most cops, they're the ones with the most resources. You know, just think about that. Think about your own community, think about where the people you know live. And if we're at a loss for fixing the wealth gap, this is obviously a no-brainer. If we really think that Black lives matter, we have to put money where our mouths are. Not only are reparations simply owed, they're a necessary foundation for any of the other racial progress we claim to want towards race equity. So again, we believe white people who support the idea of reparations can take reparative action now. We don't have to wait for the political will. We don't have to wait to disentangle white supremacy from our philanthropic world. We can work on both of those things as well, but we can also start today outside of these systems, no matter how much wealth we have. The Civil Reparations Project, through significant monthly commitments from white people, will begin moving resources out of the white community and into the Black community right now in a structural and sustained way without waiting for the political will required to implement full reparations. Again, this is the launching point of this idea, and we're hoping to gather information and insight and feedback from you all on how this lands. How this would happen. We see kind of 7 elements of reparative investment from the white community. Number 1, no more donations. We can't think of these debt payments as donations anymore. We have to remove the desire to be thanked, acknowledged, given a tax receipt or a tax deduction. Making a reparative investment in a future that looks wildly different from the shameful present would be to our shared human benefit. We need to begin contributing the most that we can as the least we can do. 2, we'd be committing to structured redistribution, building these investments into our regular finances the way that we do with our car payments, our health insurance, our student loan debt. We need to pay what we can all of the time, not once a year, not as a gift when we're feeling flush, but as a line item in our monthly budgets that the Black community can count on. Number 3, investigating and acknowledging our own wealth. I'm not talking about tracing our roots back to a particular enslaving family or plantation. The wealth made from slavery has long ago trickled into every aspect of our economy. So I'm talking about really confronting how much money we really have. Yes, we have income that is easy to calculate, but what other wealth do we have or have access to? Do we own a home? Do we have a college fund for our children? Do we have family we can borrow money from? Do we qualify for a bank loan? Many times, even the ability to go into debt is an indicator of wealth or access to wealth. So what kind of safety nets do we have that the Black community does not have? Number 4, reimagining what financial success is for us personally. What does it look like to you? Is it having enough to retire, owning a home, taking an annual vacation? When you think about it, does financial success to you personally involve leaving the wealth gap exactly as it is today? What if saving the most money possible for ourselves and our families were not a more worthy personal goal than making reparative investments, so our children and their peers do not inherit an even worse wealth gap with even less of a chance of shrinking it? What if Black liberation were attached to each one of our personal financial goals? Number 5 is recalculating what is possible. When you remove yourself from what can I give right now kind of thinking to how will I pay into this investment over time, the equation can start to change. We have some ideas on that, how to structure that kind of investment, and it's the main topic we hope you'll discuss in our breakouts in just a little while. We really would like to learn from you what's possible. 6 is to start now, start local, just start by focusing on your own ability to move money by taking care of the Black people near you, whether you know them or not. Start where you are. Ideally, this will be something that can be repeated in other geographic areas once we've proven some success, but we can start here and start now. And 7, most importantly, it's not our money. These are derivatives of whiteness that we had nothing to do with. No matter how much money we have, that is the reality of the system that we're in. We have to let go of the idea that we get to choose which Black people are worthy of receiving money, or that only those with severe need should receive it. That's not how debt works, ever. Black people are owed reparations, and if we keep our focus on moving money out of the white community, we can begin. How it is distributed among the Black community must be decided by the Black community, and that will be phase 2 of where we move these efforts, finding partners in the Black community to take the lead on distributing what we can gather. And we imagine paying for that expertise and that work. But the task at hand today is to imagine what we can move out of the white community. So what should an investment look like? There are a lot of different factors that would go into what a person might be able to give. It's a very personal thing. A lot of variables in any given family or individual, but we do want to break down a couple of the typical barriers to action that come up for white people when trying to figure this out. One is the overwhelm, right? The overwhelm to the point of immobility, thinking that because we don't have all of the answers and the data laid out in front of us and a perfect plan, that we can't act at all. And I think that's where you hear a lot of white people saying they have no idea what to do. And two is the very real culture of secrecy and privacy and shame around money that works to uphold the status quo. We don't talk about it. We don't know how much our friends have. We don't know what's possible. So we're going to try to expose that, try to break that down a little bit. And we're going to start with the four of us sharing about our own financial situations and how we arrived at the amount that we're donating to Africatown tonight and how we're thinking about making these monthly commitments going forward. And we hope that that's something you can do in your breakout sessions as well. So with a lot of conversation amongst the four of us, we kind of came up with this proposed somewhat progressive tax structure on what we think is possible. So giving 1.5% of each $50,000 of income. Again, people have very different family situations, and this doesn't account for overall wealth, but that was a starting point that we thought we could use to launch this conversation. So for me, for my investment in Africatown today, I gave $850. I am the mother of 3 children, and until this year was the sole breadwinner for the family. I used to have a job that paid about $100,000 a year and was laid off last summer. Newly pregnant with my 3rd kid, got another job until November, and then have been on unemployment since then. Not able to get a new job at 6 months pregnant when I was laid off of that 2nd job. So I have been on unemployment since November. My partner did get employment a few months ago, but my unemployment, because I used to have a high paying job, is about $56,000 a year. And so $850 that I decided to give to Africatown is 1.5% of that. I also was living as frugally as possible over the last year because of that situation. And so I find myself with the ability to make that investment. Certainly I will feel it, we're feeling it. But that is what I have to share with you all this evening. I'll pass it to Natalie.
Thanks, Caitlin. I donated, need to get away from that word. I invested $1,000, which is significantly more than what I usually choose to contribute. And I calculated that it's about 1.5% of, or a little more than 1.5%. I make $59,000 a year. I work for a nonprofit here in Seattle. But the way I looked at it was 1.5% is around what you pay if you are in a union. Those are the union dues that you pay to make your workplace better, and your union protects you. And when I think about this investment, I think about how willing we are to pay a union due at our work to make our work life better. And I think about investing in the same community that has kind of so graciously allowed me to grow here, and imagine paying that 1.5% back. And so that 1.5% I hope to invest monthly, and that would be about $895 if we were to, or when we continue a monthly civil reparations project. And I will pass it to Shannon.
Thanks, Natalie. Hi, everyone. My transparency around my wealth is that I've been financially supported by my parents through college, and so was able to graduate debt-free and now have a job with a coffee startup where I'm making $70,000 a year. I also just recently, with my partner, bought a brand new townhome in Beacon Hill, which is a gentrifying neighborhood. I'll talk a little bit more in reflection on that as I share more about Africatown Community Land Trust, because I think it's really personal for me and would love to share more. But for my donation investment, I am giving $2,100, which factors to about 3% of my salary. And I'd just like to add, I do anticipate inheriting from my parents. So that will eventually factor in, I hope, to then continue reparations. Sorry, and I want to pass it to Elizabeth.
Thank you. Yeah, so together, my partner and I, we work part-time jobs and cumulatively make about 90 grand a year. And we're both able to choose to work part-time because both sets of our parents are able to retire and help with childcare, and also helped us buy a home a couple months ago. And then when our parents pass, we will likely inherit their homes among our siblings and other factors that are unknown, and have the privilege of not having to worry so much about end of life care for any of our family members. So through these open conversations with family and my partner, we agreed that we would give 10% of our income and invest it into our community for the rest of our life. And more specifically, just for today, we invested $1,500 in Africatown Land Trust. And I'll pass it back to Caitlin.
Okay, thanks. So with that, we want to move to the breakouts, which hopefully will be the bulk of where we're really getting your thoughts this evening. We've got a couple of questions that we'd like you to ponder. A couple notes, you'll be assigned a random room. Thank you so much for hanging in there. We really appreciate it. You will be in there perhaps with people that you have not ever met before, maybe one or two that you have. But if you can, as a group, kind of tackle these questions and share what you're comfortable sharing, or maybe even a little uncomfortable sharing, that would be wonderful. The questions are, would you be interested in participating in something like a civil reparations project? If not, what are the barriers for you? And if so, what could an ongoing structural investment look like for you, or when you think about the people that you know or like-minded? How do you arrive at a number that you could commit to monthly, and what information do you need to make your decision? And number two, what are some ideas that you have for moving money out of the white community and directly to Black individuals, bypassing the nonprofit world or any sort of need for people to apply for those funds? We're looking for all kinds of solutions. It might be a technological solve, like somebody who could help develop a calculator that you could plug in your various wealth factors and income, and it can give you, just spit out a suggested amount for reparative investment. If you know groups who you think would be interested in this idea or this information that you think we should know, it'd be wonderful to hear about those, or partners in the Black community we could connect with as we look for paid partnership in distributing these funds. So we're going to take 10 minutes to have those discussions. I recommend, since it can be awkward to get these things started, to just go by alphabetical order by first name. If you're going to share about number one, maybe the person who comes first in alphabetical order can kick things off and go around that way. And then we will gather back again at 4:56 and try to hear from some of the groups, both via the chat and in reporting out. So thank you so much.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about the Africatown Community Land Trust before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I would be happy to. So as we mentioned, we'll send a follow-up email for next steps, looking for a longer term engagement in paying reparations through this project that we're inviting you to talk about today. But to start today, we want to ask you to contribute to a group that we're a big fan of called Africatown Community Land Trust. They are based in Central District here in Seattle, and they acquire, steward, and develop land assets that are necessary for the Black and African diaspora community to grow and thrive in place in the Central District. And one more statistic that I found really interesting was the Black population in this neighborhood of Seattle has gone from 73% to 18% in the past 50 years, right? And this is a neighborhood that historically was the only place Black communities could live because of racist housing and financial policy. And now, continued gentrification is pushing them out. So what I love about this Black-led organization is they're working with government and developers to try to shape the way that the neighborhood is changing for the better for communities that have historically been there. And that includes building 115 affordable housing units already in Liberty Bank building, which was the site of the first Black-owned bank in the region. They also, in their current projects, have secured over $1 million for Black contractors and are building $300,000 or less houses for prioritizing historically Central District residents for purchase. So they're doing a lot of amazing work. I actually just got a call before this event from Jamie from the organization, just really, really appreciative of all of the funds that have been donated so far. So my ask for you is to consider visiting a campaign page on the next slide, which is linked in the QR code. Natalie will also drop the link in the chat. So please go there and pay your first reparations installment, if you will. And we will follow up in email after this with some more information for how we can continue to engage on this end. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here, taking the time, and for putting your money where your mouth is.